Epilogue. You get a happy ending, and you get a happy ending, and you get a happy ending. And yes, I've got one right here. It's literally a prosthetic nipple, fully erect. As if Nips and Sips wasn't already the worst name for a restaurant slinging cheap wings and cheaper beer, the waitstaff had to wear these things under their tank tops. This idiotic, rubber, very erect nipple, which, again, served only to titillate the visual pleasure centers of horny and desperately misogynistic male diners, turned out to be the perfect representation of everything wrong with that terrible, awful, no good week of the Nicholas Green rally at the military defense contractor formerly known as Vector Defense. And you're probably expecting me to tell you how it was the very worst of toxic masculinity that ultimately resulted in such a tragic event, but I'm not going to stand on this stage and say that toxic femininity isn't to blame either. Because, let me tell you, the only reason I wound up in literally the worst situation of my life, with my Nips and Sips location burning down around me while a murderous monster psychopath was dismembering people left and right, and my boyfriend at the time, a gun fetishizing, red-blooded, GQP, God, Guns, and Country professional weapons tester, was aligning himself with another murderous psychopath in an attempt to kill Vector Defense's CEO and seize control of the company. The only reason I found myself in that situation was because when I was a little girl, the only thing my mother thought was important to instill in me was that good girls are pretty girls, and pretty girls do whatever it takes to keep their man happy. Tess Taylor held the round piece of flesh-colored prosthetic back up for the audience to see. Even if it meant wearing these dumb rubber nipples. She clicked a button on her handheld remote. The presentation screen behind her displayed an image of Brad Johnson in his prime. That perfect square jaw, piercing blue eyes, immaculately coiffed hair, and a lopsided grin that said, "Yeah, I can do whatever the fuck I want. You want to make something of it?" Tess glanced at the image, giving it a thoughtful once-over in a carefully rehearsed moment, before turning back to the audience and smirking. I mean, rampant toxicity aside, who wouldn't drop their panties for a slice of that masculine perfection? The audience laughed, just like they always did. Tess grinned right along with them, before waving a finger at them. See, that right there, that's what I'm talking about. As much as we see it, as much as we acknowledge it, both masculine and feminine toxicity is impossible to avoid. Sometimes it's as innocuous as a good-natured joke, and other times... Tess clicked the button again, and the presentation shuffled through pre-timed still images from news media coverage. The 24-hour payday loan store. Nips and Sips in flames. The Vector Defense Riot. Violence, destruction, and entirely too much blood were shown in the rotating images. And other times, it costs people their lives, she said, all humor gone from her voice. Like it almost cost me mine, because I was going to marry that guy. I couldn't wait for him to propose. Every shift at Nips and Sips was the ephemeral last shift, because I knew I'd be going home to Brad Johnson. And he would finally give me the ring my mother always told me I needed. The slide changed to an image of a 10-year-old Tess performing a plie while wearing a pink tutu. She looked adorable. Dancing and beauty pageants, that's all my mother let me do as a child. Two things that are 100% dependent on the fit, finish, and subjective beauty of your body. That's how I was programmed as a child. And when you are a child, you don't always know that your mother may just be a sick, twisted, and toxic woman in desperate need of some serious therapy. The slide changed to a picture of Tess wearing a beauty pageant sash, and her mother standing next to her, frowning at the camera. I love her, but she really did a number on me, Tess said, studying the picture for another rehearsed moment before turning back to the audience. Which, as you all know, is pretty much the least original thing a person can say about their mother. They laughed, right on cue. But that's my point. Toxicity comes in all forms, and sometimes it comes from the most sacred places. The slide changed to an old Vector Defense marketing image of Brad Johnson in the exoskeleton suit, sans shoulder-mounted missiles. I believed Brad Johnson was all I deserved. I believed I deserved nothing more than a career at Nips and Sips and all the groping and grab-assing that went with it. I believed I deserved those stupid rubber nipples. The slide changed to a familiar photo of Tess leaning in to kiss a recently graduated Richard Gebler on the cheek. Right on cue, murmurs rippled through the audience. I believed all that, all while having this guy in my life. Through apartments, boyfriends, jobs, Richard and I were best friends for years. And yet somehow, right when it would have mattered the most, we were both too wrapped up in our individual toxic victimhood that we just weren't there for each other. And do you know what happens when we don't respect each other and look after the people we love? More traumatic images of that fateful riot. Everything goes straight to fucking hell, Tess said, answering her own question. She let the ugly images sink in, waiting for the murmurs to subside before continuing. But you already know what happened that day. We were all glued to the trials, the House committee, and the Senate hearings. Every single minute of that one day has been picked apart, parsed, and examined by some of the smartest people we elect to government. Which is to say they were all idiots. Here's what you probably haven't heard, and why you're all sitting here today. The slide changed to a mugshot of a beaten and bruised Brad Johnson. After trying to murder everyone left on the rooftop, Brad was literally beaten back with a penis, which is probably the most cosmically ironic and intrinsically poetic thing to come out of all of this. I can say that because I was his girlfriend. I knew. And if you know, you know, Tess said with an emphatic nod at the audience. After the dust settled, Brad served 2 out of his 10-year sentence in the state prison. And before you start shouting about how little 10 years is for Brad's role in the riots, or how predictably his white privilege reduced it to 2 years, I will play devil's advocate and plead for even a modicum of sympathy. During those 2 years in prison, Brad Johnson was routinely raped, abused, and, near the end of those 2 years, partially castrated by a gang of white supremacists. Again, the audience murmured. Like all 15-minute celebrities, once convicted and sentenced, most of the viewing public stopped caring about the major players of the Vector Defense Riots. Tess's "Where Are They Now?" talk had proven to be an effective and popular reminder of her city's darkest hour. Today, Brad Johnson lives on a farm in Iowa, where he raises sheep, and yes, I was just as surprised as you are, writes a weekly blog for the New Yorker. The slide changed to the familiar Vector Defense executive portrait of Lorraine Dillon. Now, if anyone had a backstory rife with dramatic fodder, it was undoubtedly Lorraine Dillon. And thanks to Netflix's 28-part, 2-season documentary series, I think that backstory has been mined to death. I will tell you what I do know about Lorraine. She cut her father's dick off with a Ginsu knife after he spent years raping her when she was a child. And despite what Netflix wants you to believe, I think she did murder all those hedge fund executives in Manhattan. She has a pattern, a modus operandi, as the professionals call it. You look at all the charges she was convicted of. This woman is a supervillain straight out of the comic books, complete with her own traumatic backstory. But, again, Netflix already covered that. What they didn't cover, you remember that white supremacist rape gang that partially castrated Brad Johnson? I have it on relatively good authority that they were fulfilling transcontinental orders that originated inside a certain maximum security prison where Lorraine Dillon was serving time. Put another way, Lorraine Dillon prefers to leave no dick uncut. The audience tittered uncomfortably. Tess advanced to the next slide, which was a blank screen. You know, I just want to say, I've given this talk many times over the years, and it's always a special kind of roller coaster, both for myself as well as all of you. It means so much to me to see every one of you tonight. You've all made an effort to leave the comfort of your homes, coming out to support me and this story. It energizes me and fills me with so much inspiration. More importantly, I want you to know that I never harbor any hard feelings. Tess broke into a grin. Life's too short for that. Because, let's face it, as much as you love hearing me talk, I know why you're really here. Ladies and gentlemen, my two very good friends, Richard Gebler and Chuck Kramer. From offstage, a steady, medium-paced beat started thumping from the speakers. Bass, snare drum, a signature reverse zipper sound effect. It was a well-rehearsed, flawless beatbox performance. The audience began applauding. In the front row, Justine put her fingers in her mouth and whistled. The show never got old, not even after developing and workshopping the TED Talk-inspired presentation with Tess, Richard, and Chuck. Tess had been the right call to present, despite her many objections, but Justine had insisted. She wouldn't have been caught dead on that stage, and truthfully, once Tess found her voice, the trained dancer had proved herself a natural host for the evening's activities. And even as they toured the state, and Justine saw the show over and over again, she still couldn't help but grin as the grand finale approached. A flute entered the beatbox soundscape, and the unmistakable opening notes of "You've Got a Friend in Me" filled the auditorium as Richard and Chuck stepped out on the stage with their performance. The audience rose to their feet in rapid waves, offering the famous musical duo a standing ovation. And the people in the audience weren't the only ones standing at attention. Author's note. I know. You underestimated just how overwhelming this story would turn out to be. Your head is spinning from the absurdity, the horror, and the sheer creative joy woven throughout the tale of Richard Gebler and his dismembered member. And you're asking yourself, When will those cowards in Hollywood finally nut up and deliver the cocktastic cinematic masterpiece our world wants, nay, needs, right now? Your guess is as good as mine, but the answer is probably never. Amazon, call me, maybe? You should know this novel was a work of pure creative fantasy. And by that, I mean I tore free from every personal inhibition and indulged all the ridiculous creative instincts that normal people prefer to pretend don't exist. You should also know that the genesis of Monster Dick was exactly what you would imagine. It was the 2020 Halloween season, and I was watching horror movies with my then partner. We were midway through Jack Frost, the 1997 Murder Snowman version, not the 1998 Michael Keaton family-friendly version, which probably was just as scary, although I've never seen it, so I'm just guessing here. And when the police started shooting at the killer snowman, obviously I made the obvious joke. You can't shoot the snowman! About 5 minutes later, the title, Don't Be a Monster, Dick, was birthed into this ugly, depressing, hilariously awful world we all are suffering through. At the time, I was under contract writing a feature screenplay to be produced in the Philippines. The project had reignited my passion for screenwriting. I was prolific in my 20s, and after hammering out this action horror thriller in about 2 weeks, I wanted nothing more than to keep writing. I wrote the first 10 or so pages of a Monster Dick screenplay. Ignoring that prologue, it was Tess's opening monologue all the way through Richard's dick falling off. Then I sketched out a rough outline for the rest of the story and drafted detailed character bios for the cast. And after that, like all good creative processes, everything ground to a very stubborn halt. I could speculate as to the whys. After a year of a pandemic-driven furlough, and then being laid off, I finally landed the best professional creative job of my career. But the truth behind my creative motivation was simple. That screenplay I wrote in 2 weeks, I was paid for it. It was actually being produced. Although, as of this writing, the pandemic put the kibosh on that too. As much as I loved the screenwriting process, literally my favorite software applications tend to have Final in them, Final Draft for screenwriting, and Final Cut Pro for video editing. There wasn't any point to writing a Monster Dick screenplay on spec. Even if I wanted to shop it around, there simply wouldn't be a studio courageous enough to produce a movie about a mutant monster penis or a platform bold enough to distribute it. And if the film were produced independently, there just wouldn't be enough money to do the monster cock visual justice. Flash forward a year. I'm settled into my corporate gig, and I've just finished writing my first novel of 2022. Abraham Owens is punched, drunk, and all out of fucks. My goal for 2022 was to cast aside all other creative instincts. I have a long history on YouTube, and the drive to produce video is sometimes overwhelming, and instead focus solely on writing novels. It was a successful experiment. I found an immensely satisfying and gratifying creative routine that immediately put life's stressors into a manageable perspective. The key, of course, was a well of motivation that was entirely internal, happily buffered from external, negative influence. Easy, right? Ha ha ha. Fuck off. Anyway, the point is that after finishing Punch Drunk, I spent a month drafting detailed outlines, roughly 20,000 words apiece, for 2 potential novels. The first was the next installment in the Abe Owens saga, while the second was Monster Dick. Since I wrote Abe Owens in the first person, I decided to take a break and add a little variety to my Kindle library. Also, Amazon was being difficult about promoting a book with censored profanity in the title. Obviously, I figured I'd fare better with a book title in the shape of a penis. I started writing Don't Be a Monster, Dick on June 5th, 2022, and finished it on July 27th. It was the shortest writing process for the longest novel I've ever drafted. Unique to this writing process was an unofficial soundtrack I would often find myself celebrating and dancing to after printing out a completed chapter. I'm optimistically including links to both Apple Music and YouTube if you're interested in dancing along with my Dick-inspired soundtrack. Links are in the description below. It should go without saying that this story is deeply inspired by Jim Carrey's The Mask. The monster cock brings out what was inside Richard all along, as well as Venom, for obvious reasons, I think. While I referenced John Carpenter's The Thing, the horror aspects of the story are more in the spirit of than inspired by. Much the same way the story is in the spirit of the bold, cinematic absurdity of Kevin Smith's Tusk. Finally, as much as I try and convince myself the writing journey is its own reward, nothing compares to printing off a fresh chapter and handing it over to my partner and first reader. Thank you for your enthusiasm, patience, and thoughtful analysis, even after endless pestering. My first reader is joined here by my final proofer, who managed to catch the last handful of truly idiotic typos, while at the same time providing insightful feedback on the first real field test of the story. The journey may be its own reward, but it certainly helps to have friends along the way. All of my work is independently published. As such, its success depends on positive word of mouth. If you've gotten this far, I hope you've enjoyed this ridiculously long-winded dick joke, and will consider leaving a review on YouTube, Amazon, and Goodreads. Every little bit helps, even if it's just a thumbs up and sharing a link on social media. Thank you for listening.